Winter has arrived on the Eastern Front with a question that cuts straight through decades of Russian military mythology. What happens when the season Moscow once called its greatest ally turns into its deadliest enemy? As temperatures plunge toward -20 degrees Celsius, satellite imagery and battlefield reports show front lines frozen solid, armored columns stalled, and supply routes buried under snow. For generations, Russian doctrine leaned on the idea that winter breaks invaders. Now, in early 2026 conditions, winter is no longer repelling a foreign army. It is grinding down Russia's own forces. This shift did not happen overnight. Since late autumn, Ukrainian and Western intelligence assessments have warned that Russia entered winter overextended both militarily and economically. The Kremlin responded not by consolidating its positions, but by doubling down. Force concentrations along key sectors increased, particularly in eastern Ukraine, even as energy shortages, fuel constraints, and manpower fatigue worsened. On paper, the numbers look formidable. On frozen ground, they tell a different story. The scale of the deployment is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of troops are spread across a front, stretching hundreds of kilometers, operating in conditions that triple basic logistical requirements. Every soldier now needs more fuel, more calories, more winter gear, and constant power just to survive. The question facing commanders is brutally simple. Can an economy already under strain sustain this many soldiers in deep winter? For Ukraine's planners, the answer appears to be no, and they are shaping their strategy around that assumption. Behind the scenes, NATO intelligence sharing has played a critical role in this recalculation. According to Western defense officials speaking to major news outlets, real-time data on Russian troop movements and logistics hubs has allowed Kyiv to avoid costly frontal engagements. Instead, Ukraine is focusing on what winter makes most vulnerable: supply lines. Fuel depots, transport nodes, and energy-linked infrastructure feeding Russian operations have become priority targets. The logic is cold and mathematical. A tank without fuel at -20 degrees is not a weapon. It is a frozen liability. This winter dynamic also intersects with a broader economic battlefield. Russia is still attempting to cripple Ukraine's energy grid through repeated missile and drone strikes, particularly around major cities. Yet Ukraine has endured years of winter warfare and adapted with decentralized power systems, emergency repairs, and Western support. Russia, by contrast, is now discovering that its own winter resilience was built for defense, not for sustaining massive offensive operations, far from secure supply bases. Military historians often point out that winter does not choose sides, it punishes weakness. In this case, weakness is not courage or numbers, but logistics and money. Every stalled vehicle, every frozen generator, every delayed supply convoy multiplies the cost of war. As one Western analyst noted, recently winter is exposing the gap between Russia's ambitions and its capacity to pay for them. For viewers watching this unfold, one question looms larger than all others. If winter is already stretching Russia's system to the breaking point, what happens when the cold deepens and the bills come due? The answer begins not on the battlefield, but in the flow of supplies that keep that battlefield alive. The decision to mass roughly 710,000 troops along the Ukrainian front was meant to signal strength. Instead, it has exposed one of the most dangerous miscalculations of the war. Modern warfare is not won by headcount alone, and winter makes that reality impossible to ignore. Every additional battalion increases not just combat power, but an invisible burden of fuel, food, heating, ammunition, and maintenance that must arrive on time every day without interruption. In deep winter, that burden does not rise gradually. It explodes. Russian commanders have violated one of the most basic rules of contemporary military history: never deploy forces faster than your logistics can sustain them. Western intelligence assessments cited by major news outlets confirm that Russia increased its frontline manpower by roughly 20% ahead of winter, pushing total numbers to levels not seen since the early phases of the invasion. On maps and briefings, this looked like overwhelming mass. On frozen roads and snow-choked rail lines, it became an operational nightmare. The mathematics of winter warfare are unforgiving. A soldier who might survive on a minimal supply chain in summer now requires insulated uniforms, constant heating, additional calories, and reliable electricity. Vehicles must idle or be heated continuously to prevent engines' optics and hydraulics from freezing solid. Fuel consumption rises sharply while mobility drops. This is where scale turns from advantage to liability. The larger the force, the more catastrophic even a small disruption becomes. Ukraine's command has understood this shift and adjusted accordingly. Rather than attempting to halt Russian advances through direct confrontation, Ukrainian planners have focused on making Russia's mass unmanageable. Supply routes feeding these enormous troop concentrations are now priority targets. Snow and ice slow Russian convoys, turning logistics trucks into predictable, vulnerable choke points. When those convoys stop, entire units begin to fail, not because they are defeated in battle, but because they cannot function. Western military experts describe this as a classic example of logistics denial. Instead of destroying frontline units, Ukraine is attacking the systems that keep them alive. NATO-provided intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support has reportedly sharpened this approach, allowing Ukrainian forces to identify when and where supply disruptions will cause the most damage. The result is a battlefield where Russia's numerical advantage works against it. There are already documented cases of Russian units forced to abandon positions without significant fighting, vehicles frozen in place, generators without fuel, and soldiers suffering from cold-related injuries are becoming increasingly common. In some sectors, commanders are reportedly rotating units not due to combat losses, but because they are physically unable to remain operational. The human cost of this is enormous, but the strategic cost may be even greater. This is where economic pressure and military reality collide. Feeding, heating, and equipping 710,000 troops through winter requires an immense and continuous flow of resources. Every day this force remains deployed, it drains the Russian treasury at an accelerating rate. Unlike summer offensives, winter offers no quick gains to justify that expense. For Russia, the question is no longer whether it can hold ground. It is whether it can afford to keep its army alive where it stands. And as winter tightens its grip, the answer increasingly depends on money Russia may no longer have. That financial strain, already visible in official budget figures, is the next fault line threatening to crack the entire war effort. Nowhere is Russia's winter vulnerability clearer than in the silent war being fought far behind the front lines. This is not a clash of tanks or artillery, but a systematic hunt for the arteries that keep a massive army alive. Ukrainian strategy has shifted decisively toward logistics warfare, and winter has magnified its effects. When snow slows movement and ice limits maneuverability, supply convoys become predictable, exposed, and fatally important. Ukrainian commanders supported by NATO intelligence sharing have prioritized fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, rail transfer points, and temporary depots over armored formations. The reasoning is brutally pragmatic. A modern main battle tank, no matter how advanced its armor, is useless without fuel at -20°C. Engines seize optics, freeze, and crews face hypothermia within hours. A battalion deprived of fuel does not fight it, waits, freezes, and eventually collapses. This is where technology and terrain intersect. Ukrainian FPV drone units, many operating with Western-supplied components and targeting data, have turned Russia's rear areas into contested space. Fuel tankers and supply trucks, unable to disperse easily on icy roads, have become high-value targets. Western defense analysts note that this approach delivers disproportionate impact at relatively low cost. Destroying a single fuel convoy can immobilize millions of dollars worth of Russian equipment for days. Reports from several contested sectors describe units stranded not by enemy fire, but by mechanical failure and cold. Vehicles left running to prevent freezing burn fuel at unsustainable rates. Vehicles shut down freeze solid and require specialized recovery equipment that often never arrives. This creates a vicious cycle. The more Russia tries to sustain its forward units, the more supply traffic it generates, and the more targets it offers. Human consequences follow quickly. Russian soldiers, many equipped with outdated or insufficient winter gear, are forced to improvise. Makeshift heating methods in trenches, reliance on aging Soviet-era equipment, and overcrowded shelters increase exposure risks. For Ukrainian thermal imaging drones, these attempts to stay warm become deadly giveaways. What soldiers see as survival measures appear from above as bright, unmistakable targets against frozen terrain. Western military experts describe this as the collapse of Russia's quantity over quality doctrine under modern conditions. Numbers cannot compensate for logistics failures when technology allows precise disruption of supply chains. The battlefield becomes less about force-on-force engagements and more about endurance, and endurance is expensive. Each immobilized tank, each abandoned position feeds into a broader strategic failure. Russia is not simply losing equipment, it is losing the ability to convert resources into combat power. This is a critical distinction. Wars are not won by stockpiles alone, but by the ability to move fuel and maintain them under pressure. As winter deepens, logistics becomes the decisive front. The question is no longer how many troops Russia has deployed, but how many it can keep operational tomorrow. And with every successful strike on supply lines, that number shrinks. The military consequences are severe, but the financial consequences waiting behind them may prove even more devastating as the cost of sustaining failure continues to rise. While Russian soldiers struggle to stay warm at the front, an even colder reality is settling in hundreds of kilometers away, inside the walls of the Kremlin's own financial institutions. War is sustained by money long before it is sustained by morale. And on this front, the numbers are turning brutal. Official budget data released by Moscow itself reveals a widening gap between what the war demands and what the Russian economy can deliver. Winter has not only frozen roads and engines, it has frozen revenue streams. According to figures acknowledged by the Russian Ministry of Finance, the federal budget deficit has surged dramatically. What was already a strained balance in the previous year has expanded into a structural hole worth tens of billions of dollars. Independent analysts cited by Western media warn that this deficit is not a temporary fluctuation, but a sign of systemic stress. Every day of large-scale combat now burns through roughly $1 billion in combined military and economic costs, a pace that few economies can sustain indefinitely. The core of the problem lies in energy revenues, historically Russia's financial lifeline. Oil and gas income, which once underwrote both social spending and military modernization, has declined sharply. Sanctions, price caps, transportation bottlenecks, and discounted sales to Asian buyers have all eroded profits. Recent reporting from major international outlets shows oil and gas revenues down by roughly a third year-on-year. Even small dips in global prices now translate into multi-billion-dollar losses for Moscow's budget. To cover the gap, the Kremlin has increasingly relied on its National Welfare Fund, effectively burning through long-term savings to finance short-term survival. Western economists describe this as a dangerous feedback loop. The more Russia spends to keep its army operational in winter, the less financial resilience it retains to stabilize its economy. Interest rates have been pushed upward in an attempt to control inflation, but war spending continues to overwhelm those measures. This financial pressure has direct military consequences. Procuring modern equipment, upgrading winter gear, and repairing infrastructure all compete for the same shrinking pool of resources. Choices become unavoidable. Money spent keeping troops warm at the front is money not spent maintaining civilian infrastructure or supporting domestic industries. Budget reallocations increasingly favor immediate military needs over long-term stability, a pattern that historically precedes economic contraction. Western strategic analysts emphasize that this economic erosion also limits Russia's strategic options. Printing more rubles cannot buy access to restricted Western technology, microelectronics, or advanced logistics systems. Sanctions have turned money itself into a blunt instrument, reducing its effectiveness on the battlefield. Even with funds available on paper, Russia struggles to translate them into real-world capabilities. The deeper winter goes, the faster this financial clock ticks. Sustaining hundreds of thousands of troops through months of extreme cold magnifies costs at precisely the moment revenues are collapsing. The result is a war effort increasingly constrained not by will but by arithmetic. This raises a question with implications far beyond the front lines. If Russia is already draining its reserves to survive this winter, what resources will remain to sustain the war or the state itself when spring arrives? The answer points toward a crisis that extends from the battlefield into Russian society at large. As the strain intensifies on the battlefield and in the treasury, the consequences are now spilling decisively into Russia's civilian heartland. What was once framed by the Kremlin as a distant special military operation is increasingly felt in apartment blocks, transport hubs, and industrial centers across the country. Winter has a way of stripping away abstraction. When homes go cold and lights go out, geopolitics becomes personal. Russia's civilian infrastructure was never designed to absorb prolonged neglect under sanctions while simultaneously supporting a full-scale war economy. Much of the heating and power grid still relies on aging Soviet-era systems, vulnerable to metal fatigue, corrosion, and extreme cold. In recent winters, isolated failures were manageable. Now, with maintenance budgets redirected toward the war and spare parts restricted by sanctions, those failures are multiplying. Western media and independent Russian outlets have reported repeated heating breakdowns in regional cities, leaving tens of thousands temporarily without warmth during sub-zero temperatures. These are not isolated incidents but warning signs of systemic decay. Funds originally allocated for modernization have been diverted to missile production and frontline sustainment. The trade-off is becoming visible in frozen pipes, stalled repairs, and emergency measures that barely hold systems together. Transportation networks are facing similar stress. Railways, the backbone of both civilian mobility and military logistics, are under increasing strain. Sanctions have disrupted access to high-quality components, forcing reliance on lower-grade substitutes that wear out faster in winter conditions. Delays, breakdowns, and reduced capacity now affect not only freight, but passenger services, amplifying economic disruption in regions far from the front. Civil aviation offers another stark example. With access to Western spare parts cut off, Russian airlines have resorted to cannibalizing aircraft to keep others flying. Safety margins shrink as fleets age faster than they can be maintained. Winter conditions only magnify the risks. Icy runways, frozen hydraulics, and reduced inspection capacity turn every delay into a potential crisis. Recent mass delays at major airports underscore how fragile the system has become. From a strategic perspective, this internal pressure matters as much as any battlefield loss. NATO analysts point out that modern wars are not decided solely by frontline outcomes, but by societal endurance. Public tolerance erodes faster when hardship is felt at home rather than observed on screens. Heating failures, transport disruptions, and inflation undermine the narrative of control that the Kremlin depends on. Economic data reinforces this trend. Rising prices, higher taxes, and cuts to social spending are shrinking household purchasing power. The war economy, once presented as a source of stability, increasingly resembles a debt trap mortgaging the country's future. Every ruble spent sustaining the front line deepens stress behind it. This convergence of military overreach and civilian hardship creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more resources Moscow commits to surviving winter at the front, the less resilience it leaves at home. And as winter tightens its grip, patience may become the rarest commodity of all. The final question is whether the system can absorb this pressure, or whether it is approaching a breaking point with consequences far beyond Ukraine. At this stage of the war, the crisis facing Russia can no longer be described as military, economic, or social in isolation. Winter has fused these failures into a single systemic test of state endurance. History offers a harsh lesson here. No regime has ever survived for long, while simultaneously freezing its army at the front and impoverishing its population at home. Russia is now approaching that threshold. The core problem is not merely that money is running out, but that money itself is losing strategic effectiveness. Even if the Kremlin diverts more funds into the war effort, sanctions and export controls sharply limit what those funds can buy. Advanced microelectronics, precision manufacturing tools, and modern logistics systems remain out of reach. Western analysts emphasize that this creates a dead-end. Spending increases, but combat effectiveness does not. The war becomes more expensive without becoming more winnable. This constraint is pushing Moscow into deeper dependence on external partners. Discounted energy sales to China, ammunition imports from North Korea, and quiet appeals to other sanctioned states are no longer tactical choices, but necessities. From a NATO perspective, this shift signals a weakening strategic position. A state forced into asymmetric dependence loses autonomy, leverage, and long-term influence even if it retains raw military mass. Meanwhile, cracks are widening on the home front. Families see sons sent into brutal winter conditions with inadequate equipment. Citizens face rising prices, unreliable heating, and shrinking public services. The Kremlin's messaging struggles to reconcile these realities with claims of control and progress. When lived experience contradicts propaganda, legitimacy erodes quietly but relentlessly. Strategically, this winter may mark the point where Russia's core assumptions collapse. The belief that time favors Moscow, that endurance outweighs adaptability, and that winter neutralizes technological disadvantage is being overturned in real time. Ukraine's survival through winter, supported by Western aid and intelligence, represents not just resilience, but strategic success. For Russia, winter has become a force multiplier for failure. From a broader Western and NATO perspective, this moment matters deeply. It demonstrates that economic pressure, technological denial, and intelligence integration can reshape a battlefield without direct confrontation. The implications extend far beyond Ukraine, shaping how future conflicts are deterred or fought. As snow continues to blanket the front lines and temperatures remain unforgiving, the equation grows simpler by the day. Russia faces mounting costs, declining returns, and shrinking options. The legendary image of winter as Moscow's shield has fractured. Winter now exposes what years of conflict have concealed. The final question is unavoidable. If this winter cannot be endured militarily, economically, or socially, what comes next for a system built on the promise that it always could? This winter has transformed the war into a decisive test of endurance. Russia entered the cold season believing numbers and tradition would carry it through. Instead, winter has exposed a widening gap between ambition and capability. 710,000 troops now represent not overwhelming power, but an unsustainable logistical and financial burden. Ukrainian strategy, reinforced by NATO intelligence and Western support, has turned supply lines into pressure points, freezing combat power without decisive battles. At the same time, Russia's economy is bleeding. Energy revenues are down, deficits are surging, and long-term reserves are being burned to fund short-term survival. These pressures are no longer confined to the battlefield. Civilian infrastructure, transportation networks, and household finances are all showing signs of strain. The war's cost is now felt in daily life, not just in official statements. Looking ahead, the outlook is stark. Unless conditions change dramatically, winter will continue to erode Russia's military effectiveness while deepening domestic stress. For Ukraine, surviving this winter is already a strategic victory. For Russia, surviving it may be an unsolvable equation. So, here is the question. Is this winter the moment when pressure finally outweighs endurance? And if so, how should the West prepare for what follows? If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe for clear, in-depth coverage as this conflict continues to unfold.